Hey everybody, it is Winter Mute coming to you from the think tank, and today I'm going to tackle writing rules. Just some not like a broad spectrum of ideas. Just basically two concepts that have really stick in my craw when it comes to reading rules. Now I've been a gamer since I was 10. I had the original red box D&D thing. The older generation will know exactly what I'm talking about. That was my first exposure to real game rules. Monopoly doesn't count. So I've read a lot of rule books over the years. I've tried my hand at writing rules, and it is not an easy thing. But there are some core concepts about writing rules that you need to really pay attention to if you're going to do it, if you're gonna try it. There are two examples that pop up every so often, two core issues that pop up every so often that really bug me. So I'm going to address them in kind of a general sense. I will give some specific details and I'm going to pick on global war a little bit too. But so the first one, and everybody hears this, you want your rules to be clear and concise. And that's good. It's good to have clear and concise rules. However, is being clear and being concise weighted the same way? And I would say no. It is more important to be clear than it is to be concise. Because if you're not clear, then you're not concise. Because if the rules aren't clear, no matter how concisely they're written, I'm going to have to dig through the rest of the rule book to try and figure out what I'm dealing with. So when it comes to writing rules, being clear is more important than being concise. So if you are writing a paragraph to cover a rule, and you hit a point where it's like, okay, I can stop there, but you kind of like mentally pause and go, well, maybe I should flesh that out so that's clear. Maybe I should add two more sentences to kind of clarify. Maybe I should add an example in a sidebar, or something along those lines. The answer is you probably should. Because if you, the person who are writing the rules, stops and has that thought that maybe this needs to be clarified, it needs to be clarified. And when I've tried writing rules, I've been the person who has stopped and said, no, this makes sense because of what I said over here. So when you put those two things together, it makes perfect sense. And I've always come to regret that. When I try to explain it to people, when other people read it, when I go back and read it, because sometimes when you're working on a project, you may have a several months break where you can't get back to it. You come back to it and you read it and you go, oh, this isn't going to work. I should have added two more sentences here to clarify how this interacts with some of the other rules around it, rather than assume the person is going to be able to put two and two together. Because it's just, and that's the thing. Even though leaving those two sentences off looks like it makes it concise, and you kind of say to yourself, well, it's already covered over there. If there's any confusion, then it has failed to be concise because it is unclear, and being clear is more important than being concise. And if anybody knows computer programming, you'll be familiar with the term spaghetti code. And it's you write a bunch of code, and then you tell it to go over here, and then it doesn't quite feed back correctly. It just sort of hits a dead end, stops, and then it doesn't create a loop, because you want your program to loop, and you want the subroutines to kind of loop and always be kind of enhancing each other and working off each other and kind of running in this nice, perfect, there's never a dead stop, or it doesn't make any sense anymore. It just hits it throws in, and then sometimes that's caught when you're programming and you compile it and it throws an error and you have to go in and fix it. But sometimes it doesn't catch it and it creates this bizarre kind of like spaghetti code, and it doesn't make sense. Well, the same thing can happen when you're writing rules. And it's, so if you write a 2 paragraphs about a rule, and you know that this rule is important because of how it interacts with several other rules, or even just another rule elsewhere in the rule book, then you really need to make that clear. And how you do that is up to you. You can add another sentence or two or another paragraph. Go. However, in this instance, or one thing to take into account, however, this is an exception. However, even though this is worded this way, it works with, you need to clarify that, or give an example, in the sidebar. And specifically point to another section of the rules and say, okay, this works this way. But look at section 3 and section 4 of this part of the rules, and take them into account. So you're automatically kind of telling that person, okay, this is an important connection here. Because it's happened several times in rules where I will go in and I need to know this piece of information. I find it in the rule book, I read it, okay, I get it, I know how it works. Then you find out that wasn't correct. Because this is chapter 5. You should have read in chapter 2 where they said, this and this and this happens, and because this and this and this happens, when you read this, you need to remember that this and this and this is happening, and that changes how it's going to work out. I'm like, stop. Okay, stop. I do not even try to have encyclopedic knowledge of any rule book. I'm not even going to try. And if I feel I have to try, I'm not going to play that game. I'm not going to play that role-RPG. I'm not going to play that board game. Nope, we're done. That's why it's important for rules to reference themselves when it's necessary, and to be clear about how they're going to interact with each other. So various aspects of the rules are going to interact with each other when it arises. Now, I've also been that person who's a rules designer who will write a rule and say, okay, well, this works this way. Okay, but I know it's going to work this way in this situation, which is a little odd or maybe a little confusing for people. But I'm not going to explain that because I explained that 2 chapters prior. And again, I always come back to regret that, because then somebody else read those rules and go, and that's the question they have. And if that's the question that they keep asking, I did not write it correctly. That's a clue that I need to go back as the creator and make it more clear. One way or the other. Either add another paragraph explaining how it works, add an example in the sidebar, or add, see this rule section and this rule section for full explanation on how these work, as a way of telling the player, there's something else over here you need to think about. And this way, you don't get that spaghetti code. Instead, okay, this references this. I go over here, I read that, and then I go right back to where I was, and I keep reading. And then, this next paragraph references these set of rules, so now I can go over here and read those set of rules. Understand fully how they apply to this, and how this applies to those, and then I can go right back to where I was and kind of keep on reading through the rules. So it makes sense. It's building on, every aspect is building on another aspect. And quite frankly, if you have a section in your rule book that covers this topic, but you don't fully explain that rule in that topic, and you expect people to know that there's another chapter in that book that says that it works this way in this situation, or that, oh no, you've got to add +2 there. Okay, but none of this says I got to add +2 there. Well, yeah, but it says it over here in chapter 5. Yeah, but this is chapter 2. And this is the very first time I come across this rule. And it doesn't say anything about adding +2, and it doesn't say anything about going to chapter 5 and reading that. And if your rules don't do that, and they should, then they should. Okay? And yeah. And I've had this happen to me Zombicide, I had a problem with a reference sheet with Zombicide. Now, I can't remember if this was I think it was a reference sheet that either came with the game or was from their website. And it had, and I can't remember exactly what the situation was, but the reference sheet was very, very basic. So basic as to the point where I realized after a couple turns into the game it was useless. Pretty much useless. Because it would say you could do these options, and it would give a very brief description. But it really, all they needed to do was add 2 more sentences in small type right next to that brief explanation, and it would have been fine. But they didn't. So you go into your turn playing the rule wrong. The other more experienced players go, oh no, that doesn't work that way. It works this way. Okay. Are you sure? Well, yeah, you got to go read it in the rule book. It's like, oh, okay, so you go read it in the rule book, and yeah, they're right. But then you look at the reference sheet, and you're like, literally, in some cases, one more sentence, which would have been no problem to fit on this reference sheet, would have clarified that. So this is an actual real world example of where I feel, is an example of being clear is more important than being concise. So yeah, clear is more important than concise. That's my first pet peeve. My first pet peeve when it comes to reading rules. The next big thing is that as when you're writing rules, please never assume that your players have more than basic knowledge. And when I say that, let me define basic knowledge. Basic knowledge is just reading, writing, and arithmetic. Now, obviously, they're reading your rules. They probably know how to read. They probably know how to write. They probably know how to do basic arithmetic. But if you write a rule assuming that your players can do calculus and algebra, you got a problem. Now, if you present your game that this is how this game is going to be played, and then people who can do calculus and algebra can play your game, or it's for those people who can do that, well, great. That's unfortunate that people like me, who is only proficient in basic algebra, I never got anything beyond basic algebra, was a bit beyond me. Then that's okay. If you want to design your game that way, that's fine. That's your decision. But most game designers are not going to do that. They expect anybody to be able to pick up their rules and play them. So why would you insist or expect your players to have a certain skill set beyond basic knowledge to be able to play your game? And I'm going to pick on I'm going to point out an issue that came up with global war and the strategic rockets technology. So when I read the rules for strategic rockets, I'm like, oh, okay, strategic rockets, they're very straightforward, very simple. There's nothing too complex there. But the rules they do not say anything about it being a single-use weapon. Now, I know that the errata has updated that to say that they are a single-use weapon. And I have talked with other players, and most other players that I've talked to have said, "Oh no, I didn't think it was a single-use weapon either," because the rules don't say that. However, I have had the minority of players say, "Okay, well, obviously it's a single-use weapon. It's a strategic rocket." And my response to that is, why is it obvious? Well, it's a strategic rocket. It's a V2 rocket. Of course it's obvious. How is that obvious? Matter of fact, I will give you a very real world example of why that is an inappropriate way to look at that. I work with a guy. We'll call him Clayton, because that's his name. And Clayton is not a gamer, but I talk with him about, he knows I have a YouTube channel and he knows my kind of hobbies. And so I talk to him about some of the stuff that comes up. And when that argument was made to me, I'm like, okay, Clayton, let me ask you this. I go, if I present a game to you and it's set in World War II. Now Clayton, I should clarify, Clayton is a fairly young guy. He's only about 27 or 26, 27. but he's not stupid by any means. He just isn't, he's not as worldly. Obviously, I'm a little more worldly. I'm older. But I present a game to you and I say, here's a unit, here's its stats, here's the four or five things it can do, and that's how it works. And then you play it that way. And then somebody else comes along and goes, no, that's only a single-use weapon. What do you mean well, it's a V2 rocket. Obviously, it's only a single-use weapon. And then you as the player who read the rules, it doesn't say anything about it being single-use in the rules. Well, yeah, but obviously it's a single-use weapon. And I go, yeah, you as the player again would go, but it doesn't say anything about it being a single-use weapon in the rules. And as I'm kind of, Clayton's agreeing with me as I kind of explain my frustration with this, and he goes, hey, one quick question. What's a V2 rocket? And I go, oh, what do you mean? And he goes, dude, I don't know anything about World War II. I literally don't know what a V2 rocket is. I know you've mentioned it before in other conversations where we've talked about the war, but I don't actually know what it is. So, in a roundabout way, my point was proven 110% right there. Clayton does not know World War II like I know World War II. He would have gone into this, he would have read the rules, and he would have said, well, obviously it's not a single-use weapon. And if your response is, well, obviously it's a single-use weapon because that's how V2 rockets worked, he's going to go, I don't know what a V2 rocket is historically. And I shouldn't have to know to be able to play this game correctly. And he's right. He is absolutely 100% right. Absolutely. And so that's just an example. And I know I think it was just something that was inadvertently left out of the rules. That's all. I'm not criticizing or picking on anybody at historical board gaming or global war. It was just an example. It's the most poignant example of what I'm talking about. And this is not the only historical game that I've run into this problem with. At all. It's not at all I've seen it with other sci-fi war games where it's like, well, obviously it's infantry. Yeah, dude, we're talking about infantry 200 years from now. Who knows what tech would look like? I'm not going to assume that they can't do X, Y, and Z. I don't know. It's a science fiction world. Don't assume anything. I haven't read the books that inspired this game to be made, and quite frankly, I shouldn't have to go read those books to play the game that the books that inspired the game that I'm playing. I shouldn't have to, and quite frankly, I don't want to. They may not be my kind of books, but that doesn't mean it's a bad game that I don't want to play. So again, I'm not picking on anybody. I'm just using this as a poignant example, and I really think it was just one quick sentence that was missed when they were writing the rules, because it was it just didn't click, And I've written rules, and it's like it makes all the sense in the world up here, but when you have to put pen to paper and articulate yourself in a quick paragraph about how a rule works, you would be amazed how hard that can be if you've never done it. It seems like writing rules would be easy, but it's not. It's not. It really isn't. So these are just two pitfalls that I have fallen into before, and I want to bring up in general as kind of a game design philosophy for people, not just so that they can learn from my experience. But I would like to see more game designers, not make these, what I see as obvious mistakes, obvious problems in the way they write the rules. So that's my point, is keep these two things in mind when you're writing rules. And oh yeah, that's right, I have kids. And just take that into account when you're writing rules. And don't be upset. And so long as they're being polite about it, don't be upset if somebody reads your rules and says, this isn't quite making sense. It probably doesn't make sense. And that doesn't mean that you are bad at writing rules. That just means you need to flex that muscle more. Or it made sense up here, but it didn't quite translate to paper correctly. And you need to just choose your wording differently. And you need to add another sentence to kind of clarify. Or maybe you need to just kind of trash that whole paragraph and start over. God, I've had to do that numerous times. Okay, this is not. I need to come up with a better way of describing this rule. That's all it is. So long as they're being polite about it, don't be like, oh, well, it makes perfect sense to me. Yeah, well, it does make perfect sense to you because you're the one who came up with it. But as soon as you hand it off to somebody else, which you need to do at some point, and they come back with, everything's good except for these 5 things that kept creeping up, well, then those are 5 things you, as the designer, need to address. These are just 2 examples of the big ones that just drive me nuts. Absolutely drive me nuts. So that's why I'm making this video, just putting it out there as something for people to be aware of. In general, if you also want to kind of write rules and just hopefully, we're still in the golden age of board games. And so, hopefully stuff like this won't keep happening, and game designers will look at all the other games that came before and kind of go, okay, yeah, I see the mistake there, and I see the mistake there, and so those guys' mistakes I can learn from, and I always try to do that. So anyway, those are my 2 points. This is Wintermute signing off.